Hello, I'm BJ Rudell with POLIS, Center for Politics at Duke University, part of the Sanford School of Public Policy. Our special guest today is Dr. Michael Bitzer. Dr. Bitzer is the TP and JC Leonard Chair of Political Science and Professor of Politics and History at Catawba College in Salisbury, North Carolina. He is an expert on U.S. politics and Southern politics, and even more specifically, he's one of the nation's top thinkers on North Carolina politics. Perhaps no site captures the state of North Carolina politics better than Dr. Bitzer's blog, Old North State Politics, in which he presents the kind of insights and analysis not found anywhere else. So with that, Dr. Bitzer, thank you for joining us today.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. Well, my first question, your recent Old North State Politics essay is titled Investigating North Carolina's Absentee by Mail Vote Method. As with most of your writing, I thought I understood the subject and then realized how much I still have to learn. So what can you tell us about absentee by mail voting in North Carolina, including how to even request and return an absentee by mail ballot?
Yeah, I think the current discussion that we're having in the country, considering COVID-19 and what potentially may affect the fall general campaign and the election, has really shown a spotlight on voting by mail. And in North Carolina, voters can utilize basically three different ways of casting ballots. One is absentee one-stop, which we commonly refer to as early voting, in-person early voting. Absentee by mail is a second method. And then, of course, election day in-person voting. And so what we've seen since 2008 is really the predominance of casting ballots in presidential years has been through absentee one-stop. In 2016, 62% of all the ballots cast came through absentee one-stop. And in that same year, absentee by mail was about 4%. So if you combine those two early vote methods, 2/3 of North Carolinians cast their ballots before election day. Wow. And I think with the discussion about states moving their primaries to voting by mail, the president declaring that voting by mail, which he did for the Florida presidential primary, leads to fraud. And I should say here, that's wrong. I thought it would be helpful for folks to have the data, facts about mail-in voting here in North Carolina. And so it can be a very small percentage, but it can have some dynamics that are different from those folks who show up for early voting, the absentee one-stop, and the folks that show up on election day. And so I'm very much a kind of data geek. I'm a political scientist. And I think that too much of our politics nowadays is purely opinion rather than actual fact. So I wanted to give some information about who votes using absentee by mail ballots. And I'm glad you asked the question about the process, because I think that's going to be important for North Carolinians to know. 5 different states across the country do their votes by mail completely. They send without having to request, they send an absentee by mail ballot to their registered voters. The registered voters mail it back or drop it off in a secured box. For North Carolina, it's a different process. I consider it to be a 2-stage process in that you have to first request the ballot through an approved form, and you can find that on the State Board of Elections website. And once you submit that request, the County Board of Elections will mail you the ballot. You then cast your votes on that ballot, but you have to vote with either 2 witnesses present or 1 witness who is a notary public. And this is kind of the changes to the absentee by mail system coming out of Bladen County, the 9th Congressional District's allegations of ballot fraud. And so this is all important information, I think, for North Carolinians to be aware of. You can actually start to request your absentee by mail ballot today, even though the election is in November. So I think a lot of North Carolinians may be choosing that method.
That's very good to know. You described, speaking of you mentioned being a data geek, and you described that your essay is full of rich data that in 2008 and 2012, North Carolina absentee ballots by mail were cast by nearly twice as many registered Republicans as registered Democrats, 54% to 28% in 2008 and 50% to 29% in 2012. And that gap narrowed significantly in 2016, where the split was 40% Republican, 31% Democrat.
Yeah.
Do you think that narrowing in light of new policies and changing demographics, do you think that will continue to narrow in 2020?
I think so, because the trend that we have seen, not just for absentee by mail ballots, but also absentee one-stop, the in-person early voting, both political parties have learned from the other political party. And the reason that I say that is in 2008, when Democrats had a very strong showing of absentee one-stop, the in-person early voting, Republicans have since learned their lesson, and they've been catching up in time to also utilize absentee one-stop. I think Democrats have also learned that lesson, because when I looked at the 2018 midterm elections, what I saw was, even though Republicans had been leading in 2006, 2010, and 2014 with mail-in ballots, it was actually registered Democrats that had the most midterm absentee by mail ballot requests at 41% to Republicans only 27%. So I think both political parties tend to learn from the other party, and so it could be a potential leveling out in terms of what we see voters casting their ballots come the fall of 2020.
Another aspect of your research shows that in the last 4 quadrennial elections, so during presidential years since 2004, white North Carolinians have comprised between 84 and 89% of absentee ballots cast by mail, despite making up only about 71% of the state's population, at least currently. Meanwhile, African Americans haven't exceeded 9% share of absentee ballots by mail since reaching 13% in 2004, yet they make up currently about 22 to 23% of the state's population.
Yeah.
Why do you think this disproportionate demographic gap exists in absentee by mail balloting?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think each vote method has its own internal dynamics. I think for African American voters, what we tend to see, and what I think is happening in that particular voting community, is that they want to see their ballot deposited or securely given, and the best way to do that is through in person. North Carolina has had a history and a legacy of voter discrimination, and I think for just simply peace of mind, what Black voters tend to do is they tend to show up in person. And in fact, with absentee one-stop, they overrepresent themselves using that voting method. In 2008, in Barack Obama's first campaign in the state, which he won very narrowly, 28% of all the in-person early votes came from African American voters. That increased to 29% in 2012. Now that dropped in 2016 down to 23%, so kind of at the norm of what we tend to see in the voter pool, and that's probably because Barack Obama wasn't on the ballot in 2016. So I think, we'll have to watch the dynamics within each of these voting methods, and particularly if COVID-19 concerns are really still present, even come October. I think what the dynamic is going to be is people are going to want to have that security of mind for their health and their well-being, but it also runs up against, is my vote going to be securely cast in this kind of a context? That's going to be an interesting dynamic to see play out.
Can I ask you, do you think there's some policy that could be implemented to ensure that any voter can then confirm, or does it exist? Can people go on a website and make sure that their vote counted?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, the State Board of Elections has that data, has that information, and you can see when say, for example, you decide to vote by mail. You can see when the County Board of Elections received that request, you can see when the ballot was sent out. And then when you return it, you can see when the ballot was received. So that information is publicly available. The question becomes, with the fallout from the North Carolina 9th Congressional District, some of that data has been withheld in terms of campaigns and strategists using that data to their advantage. I think for the public, the concern about the ballot being received is a genuine one, and that information is publicly available.
Great to know. Last December, a federal district court blocked North Carolina's recently approved voter photo ID requirement, which would have required North Carolina voters to present a valid photo ID in order to vote. And it remains to be seen whether this injunction will continue. But if the voter photo ID law is back on the table, essentially, in time for the November election, to what extent, obviously with COVID-19, who knows? There's a whole bigger variables to contend with. But in a vacuum, is it possible to address to what extent Republicans might or might not gain an advantage with a voter photo ID law?
We had a voter ID law in effect for the March 2016 primary, but that was later struck down as unconstitutional. So we've had one recent election with that impacted, but that was a primary election, which is very different from a general election, what we'll experience here in 2020. Like so many things, and I think you've alluded to, the question in political science in terms of the research on the effects of voter ID is very much dependent on the type of law, the type of election, and the individuals that participate in it. And what we're seeing here in North Carolina is if the voter ID law goes back into effect, it's a fairly lenient law. There are strict versions of voter ID law that require only one or two types of government IDs. Mm-hmm. North Carolina is a little bit broader in the way that the General Assembly has constructed the law that's under challenge right now. But the research on voter ID is kind of all over the place as well. One study out of Georgia that I'm familiar with did find that a voter ID law did produce a suppression effort among those that lacked the proper ID, and the turnout was about 0.4 of a percentage point lower. But there wasn't any empirical evidence to say there was a racial or ethnic component to the suppression. Other studies have kind of found a negative impact as well on participation by registered voters, but that tends to be for less educated and lower income populations, but not necessarily racial differences. So, there's a lot of questions still out there about the impact and the effect. I think, like you said, we are just going to have to wait and see how that plays out, if that law is still on the books and applies to the 2020 general election.
And also, a Democratic presidential candidate has won North Carolina only once in the last 10 presidential elections, something I think I thought deep down, but I didn't really realize until I noticed that Jimmy Carter was the last one
back
before.
in 1976, exactly.
Yeah. So, much can change, obviously, as we said, between now and Election Day. And you've acknowledged in your Old North State Politics blog that what will happen, I think I'm quoting you, is anybody's guess at this point. So it's unfair for me to ask you to expound on that. But at the same time, I'd like you to, in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, to what extent do you think, if we're still in the same non-normal situation in September, October, as more people are starting to get their absentee ballots by mail in, which party do you think that favors if there's suddenly this massive campaign push to see who can mail out the most ballots?
Yeah, I think I have to stick with it's anybody's guess at this point. And you're not alone in trying to push me on that. I get reporters all the time asking me about that. My early sense is right now the campaigns are recognizing this is a fundamentally different environment, not just with COVID-19, But I think with people's expectations and their energy and their enthusiasm and everything that COVID-19 could bring to the campaign cycle come the fall, the campaigns and the strategies are going to have to change radically.
Yeah.
And I do think the parties learn what is available to them when it comes to the rules of the voting game, and they will use that to their advantage.
Right.
But there are so many other factors that are potentially going to be at work this fall. Things like, what is the president's approval rating in North Carolina or in any other state? Is this election a referendum on the president? That's most likely. What's the enthusiasm level for partisans? What's the economy doing come this summer and into the fall? And all importantly, how do the campaigns change their tactics related to this? I think that they are going to look at vote by method balloting as a critical resource that has never been so in North Carolina. Remember, only about 5% in presidential years of the ballots come by mail. You know, if we're looking at 5 million votes potentially coming in this fall, that 5% could easily escalate much higher. Yeah. And that kind of dynamic, I think, again, is going to be anybody's ball game to really kind of understand.
So October 31st, I'll ask you again, and we might have a better sense.
I think once we get a sense of not just the requests, but the mail outs and the returns, and we will have the return information, we will be able to see and can match up. I can match up with the data of how people have voted in the past, their vote methods. We can then see, boy, are people really transitioning who would have normally voted in person either early or on election day. They are going by mail. This could be the whole new dynamic in the ball game.
Right. Well, we'll leave it at that, Dr. Bitzer. Thank you so much for taking the time. This was incredibly educational and really makes me want to ask you. I'm serious. In 6 months or so, what's changing, because this is one of those elections that I think, you know, people probably would have been talking about it for decades anyway.
Yeah.
But I think this is one of those, decades of the century kind of situations where the country is not necessarily going to encounter anything like this for the rest of the century. And this could really shape things.
Exactly. And as somebody who teaches campaigns and elections, let's hope that this is a once in a century type of environment that we are in. But you're exactly right. I think for many political scientists who have been studying this campaign season and who study campaigns, they were looking at this as a critical year. It has ramped up even further beyond, I think, what a lot of people are expecting. So I would welcome the opportunity to come back and share some more insights and thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Bitzer. Once again, Dr. Michael Bitzer at Catawba College, thank you for spending the time with us today.
My pleasure.